Hey friends, welcome back to Midweek as we continue through our journey titled Evidence. And as Easter approaches this weekend, right, Easter Sunday, all this evidence that we've been talking about for the last few weeks points to the resurrection of Jesus being historically accurate and just simply making the most sense when you put all the evidence stacked together. Now, there are 12 minimal facts that we've been studying. We're hitting the top 6, and we've done 4 already. So if you need a recap of where we've been, I challenge you to go back and check out the other videos that we've done in this series, and it'll get you caught up. Because tonight we're going to talk about minimal fact number 5 and minimal fact number 6. And both of these are conversion stories. And so we've got 5 is the conversion story of James, and then 6 is the conversion of Paul. Now, we highlight Paul quite often because he is a powerhouse in the New Testament. I mean, he's written the majority of the New Testament books that we have in our Bible, but James is often overlooked, and a lot of us don't really understand the story behind James and that the fact that he was converted. You would just think that all the siblings of Jesus would have just come to believe that, right? I did too. But come to find out, the Bible tells us actually a very different story. See, I would be under the same impression. If Mary had a miraculous birth, you would assume that her and Joseph would tell this story to their children, and they would all just kind of come to know that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah in whom is promised to the world. But they didn't believe that. In fact, if you go to Mark chapter 3, what you're going to see is Jesus is calling his disciples together, right? He's got a crowd of people following him, and now he's pulling them up to a mountainside, and he invites only those in whom he wishes. And so they come up to the mountainside, and he elects them the apostles, right? The disciples who are going to walk with him, talk with him, eat with him, run with him. Whatever they do, they're going to be doing it together. And so Jesus appoints the 12. He lets them know, hey, you guys are going to have power to do incredible things. You're going to heal people. You're going to cast out demons. But more importantly, you're going to go preach the message that the Father has given to me to go share to the world. That is going to be your challenge and the charge that I give you. And so immediately it takes us from there where Jesus is now going back to his hometown. Now, if you look, what Jesus says later on in Mark chapter 6 is that he says that prophets and people like me, they're not welcome in their hometown. Specifically, he mentions their own home. And I wonder why that is, right? Well, he gives us an indication here. So in Mark chapter 3, what's happening is they all start to come over to Jesus's house, the house that he grew up in. And it says that it gets so full and overwhelming that they can't even sit down to eat. Now, what this looks like for me is when I grew up, my grandma, she had 5 children of her own. And then as I started to grow up, all of my aunts and uncles, my dad included, they all had children of their own. And so my grandparents' house got pretty small pretty quick. And then as I started to grow up and all my cousins, myself, we started getting families of our own. Now we're several generations deep trying to fit into this little 2-bedroom house, and it just got overwhelming. And so we had to start renting out community buildings and Legion halls just to have holiday festivals and like Christmas and Thanksgiving and Easter and all those good things, because as the family grew bigger, we needed more space. That's the imagery I get right here, is that they're in this small little house and Jesus has a flood of people following him, and it's just getting crowded. People are uncomfortable and they get angry. And look at what it says in Mark chapter 3, starting with verse 20. It says this: Then he went home, we've already explained that, and the crowd gathered again so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying he is out of his mind. Did you catch that? This is Jesus's family, right? The siblings that he grew up with. Now, the only person who I think would look at this and say anything different would be his own mother, Mary. We assume at this point, Joseph is no longer in the picture. He has probably gone and passed away. So this is Mary and all of the children. And the siblings are really struggling with believing in who Jesus really is. I mean, come on, if your siblings grew up with you and all of a sudden you claim to be the Messiah, of course they're going to have something to say. But this was a legit thing. They didn't believe in who Jesus was. You see that pretty evidenced into the scriptures. It wasn't until Acts chapter 1, verse 16, I believe it is, or 14, where it says that this is after Jesus has risen from the grave and now has ascended. They all kind of come around Mary and they pray with her and the brothers. Now, brothers in the Greek is the term that they use here is for siblings, so brother and sister. And so what they're doing is they're gathering together, they're praying, and they're all in one accord, it says, which means they're now like-minded. So what happened? What changed between here, not believing, to Acts chapter 1:14, where they're all praying together under one accord, under one belief system? They all know the truth now. What changed here? Well, it's the resurrection of Jesus. And the reason James's conversion story is so powerful is for two reasons. He can attest to the fact that Jesus lived a perfect life. That's why Mark 6, when he says that a prophet or a preacher or whatever is not welcome in their hometown, specifically because of their families and the household and the communities they grew up in, is because everybody knows who you were, right? They get to know the real you. They get to know the person who was sinful, the one who made mistakes, the classmates that you grew up with in school. Like, they're going to know, like, hey, Brandon, you are definitely not perfect. And to be honest, that was a fear coming back to work in the community in which I grew up in, is because I wondered, is there going to be any validity to the ministry that I've been a part of for so long, or is it going to be tainted because of who I was in high school? Right now, look at your family. Right? It's hard to go and try to talk and preach to your family because they all know you better than anybody else in the entire world. You know what I mean? They remember who you were growing up. They know who you are if you're still close with them today. They've seen the mistakes that you've made. So the reason James's conversion is so important is because he is one of the few that can attest to the fact that Jesus never sinned. He can go to anybody and say, I grew up with this guy. I know for a fact that he lived a perfect life, right? A perfect life. So these two things, the fact that he could attest that Jesus lived a perfect life, even from birth until he grew into his ministry, knowing everything he's done, seeing him grow up, knowing that he's always been respectful and honorable and just living a perfect life. He can attest to that, but also the resurrection of Jesus himself is what helps with the conversion narrative. Now, Eusebius, he's a church scholar of the history of the church. And so this guy writes about James, and he says that he was known as the just one. And the reason James is known as the just one is because he followed the law of the Old Testament to a T. He was very loyal to the Jewish customs. And that's probably why he's having a hard time understanding that Jesus is the Messiah, especially when all of your brothers and sisters who were under the Jewish faith, Jesus himself being a Jew, they all value the law. So James is having a hard time breaking that, but because he can attest that Jesus was perfect, and now after the resurrection of Christ, seeing him specifically, remember Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15, that James was specifically sought after. Jesus appeared to him specifically. James and Paul, right? And then we get Paul, where we see his conversion story happen 3 times in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 9 is the first time we see this. And so as he starts to tell his story, which I won't tell you all about that because we talk about his conversion all the time, but he was known as Saul of Tarsus. And then when Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, everything changed for him. He became an eyewitness to the resurrected Christ. And Jesus says to Saul, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he basically doesn't have an answer. And so then he tells him to go into Damascus. He gets baptized. Now he becomes a follower. And as we talked about last week, he goes to Arabia for a few years just to process this moment. And when he comes back, he comes with a fiery vengeance and he's ready to preach the gospel. And so a lot is happening, but these 2 conversion stories give us greater evidence to show that the resurrection of Jesus both happened and just makes the most sense. And so as we approach Easter Sunday, as you've been through the top 6 minimal facts, I hope that you look at this and you start stacking this up to the point where you can tell that just this moment in history just makes the most sense for what we believe took place. And that is that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again. Friends, have a great Easter. And if you have nowhere to go, we invite you to come celebrate with us as we give it over to Jesus and we celebrate the resurrection of his death. Because of his resurrection, you and I get to share in that too. Have a great week.